Congress returns to work right after Labor Day. The Senate resumes debate Tuesday, September 2nd, on the remaining appropriations bills that fund the federal government. Those spending bills include funding for the District of Columbia, Interior Department, including the National Endowment for the Arts, and funding for the Departments of Labor, Health, and Education. The new federal budget year begins October 1st. This week, the National Transportation Safety Board met to announce the results of their investigation into the ValuJet crash. In May of 1996, ValuJet Flight 592 crashed shortly after its takeoff from Miami International Airport. All 110 of the passengers aboard the plane were killed. For the last year, the NTSB has been looking into possible causes of the accident. On Tuesday, members discussed and voted on their final report. The meeting's nearly 6 hours.
They're all the same. All right. Good morning and welcome to the National Transportation Safety Board. Under the 1976 Government in the Sunshine Act, multi-member federal agencies conduct much of their business in open session. Therefore, board meetings are often called sunshine meetings. While the public is invited to observe today's meeting, only the board members and NTSB staff will participate in today's discussion. A handout has been prepared for those observing today's meeting and is available at the press table, explaining in detail the proceedings that you will be observing today. If you have further questions, who has the copies? Mr. Ted, would you please raise your hand and description of the proceedings. We are meeting in this session today to discuss the final report of our investigation into the crash of ValuJet Flight 592 on May 11th, 1996. It is our board notation 6704B. It goes without saying that the ValuJet crash was a national tragedy, leaving in its wake the loss of 110 persons. The repercussions have been wide-reaching. The airline itself ceased service for several months. SaberTech surrendered its operating certificate. The FAA was forced to reevaluate its oversight procedures, and the industry and the FAA revisited the issue of fire detection and suppression systems in cargo compartments. I said many months ago that when we ultimately determine what caused this accident, I would not be surprised if we find it was a result of previous lessons learned and forgotten. Those previous lessons will be discussed at length today, and we hope to answer many questions that have arisen as a result of this accident. I note that we have about 70 family members in attendance today. I join my colleagues on the board in expressing my condolences for your loss and hope that the exhaustive investigative effort you hear about today will assure you that we have done everything in our power to see that such an accident like this never happens again. I want to thank the news media for attending this meeting and helping to inform the public of our findings. But I request that no interviews be conducted in this room while the meeting is in session, and that if you want to engage in a private conversation, you please do so outside of this room. We have a long agenda ahead of us, and with those opening comments, I will now ask our Managing Director, General Kenneth Jordan, to introduce the staff and begin our meeting. General Jordan.
Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman and members, to my left is Mr. Dan Campbell, the General Counsel for the agency. To my right is Dr. Bernard Loeb, the Director of the Office of Aviation Safety. To his right is Mr. Gregory Feith, the investigator in charge. To his right is Mr. Kurt Anderson, the Maintenance Group Chairman. To his right is Captain Benjamin Berman, the Operations Group Chairman. To his right is Dr. Merritt Berkey, the Fire and Explosions Group Chairman. To his right is Mr. James Henderson, the Hazardous Materials Group Chairman. To his right is Mr. Robert Chipkovich, the Chief Hazardous Materials and Pipeline Division. To his right is Mr. Robert Swain, the Systems Group Chairman. To his right is Dr. Daniel Bauer, the Aircraft Performance Group Chairman. And on the far right is Mr. Barry Sweedler, the Director of the Office of Safety Recommendations. Mr. Greg Feith will make the opening presentation.
Please proceed, Mr. Feith.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, members of the board, ladies and gentlemen. On May 11th, 1996, at approximately 14:14 Eastern Daylight Time, Flight 592, a Douglas DC-9-32, operated by ValuJet Airlines Incorporated, crashed in the Florida Everglades about 11 minutes after departure from the Miami International Airport. The regularly scheduled flight had departed Miami in visual meteorological conditions and was en route to Atlanta's Hartsfield International Airport in Atlanta, Georgia. Approximately 6 minutes after departure, the first officer contacted the air traffic controller and requested an immediate return to Miami International Airport because of smoke in the airplane. After about 3 minutes, approximately 3 minutes after the request, Flight 592 crashed into the swampy vegetation of the Everglades in a right-wing low, nose-low attitude at a high rate of speed. The airplane was destroyed by impact forces, and the 2 pilots, 3 flight attendants, and 105 passengers were killed. The accident flight was scheduled to depart Miami at 1300 local time and arrive in Atlanta about 14:30. However, the flight was delayed approximately 30 minutes due to the late arrival of the inbound flight from Atlanta. Just before the airplane pushed off the gate, COMAT, or company material, consisting of 5 boxes of chemical oxygen generators that had been marked empty on the flight manifest, and 3 aircraft tires were loaded in the forward cargo compartment in the area of the cargo door. Flight 592 began to taxi to runway 9 at 13:44 and eventually took off at 14:03. Now, I want to play an animation at this point that shows the motions of the aircraft during the last little over 2 minutes of flight.
Yes, we will pause at this moment. If any of the family members would prefer not to see the animation or the video footage that is going to follow in Mr. Feith's presentation, we'll take a moment here, and you certainly be glad to exit the room, and then we will pause briefly to have you come back in if anyone would like to leave. Please proceed, Mr. Feith.
Review of the cockpit voice recorder and the air traffic control transcript revealed that the captain was flying the airplane and the first officer was handling the radio communications. At 14:10:07, as the airplane was climbing through about 10,600 feet, the CVR recorded the captain saying, quote, "What was that?" The first officer responded, "I don't know." Following the exchange, the captain and first officer discussed an electrical problem. About 13 seconds later, the captain stated, quote, "We need to go back to Miami." About 3 seconds later, the CVR recorded a voice from a female saying, "Fire, fire, fire, fire," and the FDR recorded the right engine thrust decreased to flight idle, and the left engine thrust remained at the climb power setting. At 14:10:32, the first officer had contacted the air traffic controller and stated that Flight 592 needed immediate return to Miami. When queried by the controller for the reason for the return, the first officer responded, "Smoke in the cockpit, smoke in the cabin." 14:11:12, the CVR recorded the flight attendant saying, quote, "completely on fire." This was followed shortly thereafter by a radio transmission from the first officer requesting the closest airport and radar vectors. During this period of time, the aircraft was heading on a northwesterly heading. The CVR recording was eventually interrupted by a decrease in electrical power for about 1 minute and 12 seconds. At 14:12:57, when the cockpit voice recorder began recording again, the most predominant sound recorded on the CVR until impact was the sound described by the CVR group as, quote, "loud rushing air." We were not able to identify that sound with any type of spectrum analysis or post-accident flight testing and recording. And as you can see in the animation, we have indicated altitude, indicated airspeed, and magnetic heading. All of this was derived from the FDR up until the FDR stopped recording at 14:12:43, or about 1.5 minutes before the airplane crashed into the Everglades. However, additional information that was derived from recorded radar data indicated that Flight 592 had been tracking on a northwesterly heading until about 14:11:25, when the rate of turn and the flight path heading progressively changed to an easterly direction. Simultaneous to the heading change, the rate of descent also increased. In fact, Flight 592 descended 6,400 feet over the next 32 seconds and then momentarily leveled out at an altitude of about 900 feet before the airplane abruptly turned to a southerly heading and radar contact was lost. And that's what you're seeing now is the turn. We had a significant roll. The airplane will roll back through level and then roll to the right to a southerly heading. The airplane eventually crashed at a speed in excess of 400 knots. The animation is stopped before it's depicted impacting the ground. But again, this part of the animation was derived from recorded radar data. With regard to the investigation, the on-scene portion of the investigation was conducted over a 6-week period in Miami. Approximately 75% of the airplane wreckage was recovered from the Everglades and subsequently examined in a hangar at the Tamiami Airport. The examination of the wreckage included a construction of a 3-dimensional mock-up of the forward cargo compartment. The cargo liner material, airframe support structure, wire bundles, and other relevant pieces of wreckage were mounted in their approximate position in an effort to determine the location of the fire, its propagation path, and the parts of the airplane most affected by the fire. Other aspects of the investigation revealed that ValuJet had contracted its heavy maintenance to several 14 CFR Part 145 repair stations, which included SaberTech Incorporated. Between February 1996 and April 1996, SaberTech maintenance personnel had removed approximately 150 chemical oxygen generators from 3 MD-80 airplanes that had been purchased by ValuJet and were being reconfigured to ValuJet specifications. During the removal process, about 6 generators were either inadvertently or intentionally expended by SaberTech maintenance personnel. The chemical oxygen generators removed from the ND-80 airplanes were mounted in the Passenger Service Unit, or PSU, as you see depicted up on the screen now, and were being replaced because the majority of the generators had exceeded their 12-year service life. The chemical oxygen generator is designed to provide a supply of oxygen to a passenger in the event of a loss of cabin pressure. The generator is constructed of a stainless steel outer skin that surrounds an inner cylinder containing a combination of chemicals, including sodium chlorate. There is a spring-loaded percussion cap initiating mechanism on one end of the cylinder and a lanyard that connects each mask to a single pin that restrains the initiating mechanism. And in this photograph, you see that the black thing sticking from the left side of the initiating mechanism is the retaining pin. The retaining pin assembly is designed to become dislodged and release the initiating mechanism with a pull force of approximately 1 to 4 pounds. When the retaining pin is dislodged, the initiating mechanism strikes a percussion cap, and a minute explosion within the cylinder provides the necessary energy to start an exothermic reaction that liberates oxygen and generates heat. The heat generated during the exothermic reaction typically ranges between 450 and 500 degrees Fahrenheit. To prevent accidental activation of the chemical oxygen generators during shipping and handling, a yellow plastic safety cap is installed over the percussion cap. The cap is removed when the generator is installed in the airplane. And in this photograph, you see the yellow cap with the tab on it. That is mounted over the top of the percussion cap, where you see the pointer now. That cap is removed once the oxygen generator is installed in the PSU in the aircraft. The SaberTech maintenance personnel who removed the oxygen generator did not install the yellow safety caps after removal from the airplanes, nor did they dispose of those generators that had exceeded the 12-year service life. In addition, the remaining 144 oxygen generators were placed in boxes, moved to the ValuJet storage area in SaberTech's shipping area, and left unattended with no markings or labels identifying the contents of the boxes or that the contents were hazardous. SaberTech employees were told by management to clean the facility in preparation for an audit by a potential customer. As part of the cleanup, the aircraft parts in the ValuJet storage area, which included these 144 oxygen generators, were packaged in 5 boxes with a layer of plastic bubble wrap, sealed, marked as COMAT, and identified on the shipping manifest as, quote, oxy canisters empty, end quote. Although ValuJet Airlines operates as a, quote, will not carry airline, which in plain language means they will not carry hazardous materials, on the day of the accident, the 5 boxes of oxygen generators and 3 airplane tires were delivered to the ValuJet ramp and loaded on Flight 592. Of the approximately 25 oxygen generators found at the accident site, many of them bore evidence of internal and external fire and or heat damage. Dr. Merritt Berkey will discuss these generators and the post-accident fire testing later in this meeting. The safety issues that were identified by staff and discussed in the report are as follows. Minimization of hazards posed by Class D cargo compartments, posed by fires in Class D cargo compartments, equipment, training, and procedures for addressing in-flight smoke and fires aboard cockpit, aboard air carrier airplanes, guidance for handling chemical oxygen generators and other hazardous aircraft components, SaberTech's and ValuJet's procedures for handling company material and hazardous material, ValuJet's oversight of its contract heavy maintenance facilities, FAA's oversight of ValuJet and ValuJet's contract maintenance facilities, FAA's and Research and Special Programs Administration Hazardous Materials Program and Undeclared Hazardous Materials in U.S. Mail, and ValuJet's procedure for boarding and accounting for, quote, lap children. The following staff members were involved in the investigation of ValuJet Flight 592. And I'd just like to say at this point that those of us that were in the Everglades for the 6 weeks spent a lot of time down there and dedicated a lot of time during the course of this investigation. Some of the investigators, once they returned from the Everglades, were then summoned to go to New York to work on the investigation of TWA 800. And so those people should be credited with the fact that they spent a lot of time away from home. The following staff members were involved: Ben Berman, Aircraft Operations; Dr. Malcolm Brenner, Human Performance; Frank Hildrup, Aircraft Structures; Bob Swaim, Aircraft Systems; George Anderson, Power Plants; Kurt Anderson, Aircraft Maintenance; Deborah Eckroat, Aircraft Maintenance; James Henderson, Hazardous Materials; Al Wrighton, Cockpit Voice Recorder; Dennis Grossi, Flight Data Recorder; Dr. Dan Bauer, Aircraft Performance; Dr. Merritt Berkey, Fire and Explosion; Nora Marshall, Survival Factors; Greg Solatola, Meteorology; Richard Wentworth, Air Traffic Control, Dr. Mitch Garber, Medical and Pathological, Derek Nash and Frank Zakar, Metallurgy. Mike Benson was the Public Affairs person on scene, and Vice Chairman Robert Francis was the board member on scene that accompanied the team to the accident. Jim Rosenberg and Karen Burry were the report writers, and Lisa Royden is the editor. In addition to our staff, I'd also like to thank the following organizations for the participation in the Safety Board's investigation and their contributions to this report: the Federal Aviation Administration, ValuJet Airlines, SaberTech, Scott Aviation, McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Corporation, Pratt & Whitney Engines, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, Association of Flight Attendants, Research and Special Programs Administration, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. In addition, we had air safety investigators from the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore and the Canadian Transportation Safety Board participate in this investigation as technical observers under the auspices of ICAO Annex 13. And finally, I would also like to thank the men and women from Metro-Dade Police, Fire Rescue, Florida Emergency Management, the state of Florida, and the hundreds of volunteers from many different organizations, as well as the community, who had come together under adverse and tragic circumstances to aid in the recovery of the victims and assist the Safety Board in its investigation and completion of its mission of accident investigation. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Feith. At what point is Dr. Berkey going to make his presentation? Is that under one of these agenda items?
Yeah. Yes, it was.
Which agenda item?
The first agenda item.
Under the first agenda item.
Merritt Berkey, and then
Very
he's
well.
Right.
I want to note for the record that party submissions were received from ValuJet on July 9th, 1997, a letter of clarification from Scott on July 29th, 1997, a submission from SaberTech that was undated but was received in my office June 6, 1997, and a submission from ValuJet that was received at the Safety Board on August 1st, 1997, and from SaberTech on August 12th, 1997. So in addition to the 250-page report that has been prepared by staff, those submissions as well have been reviewed by all 5 of the board members and are possible subjects for discussion at today's board meeting. And I thank those parties for their submissions. Before we get into a discussion of the issues as outlined, I would like to see if any of the board members have questions on the factual presentation presented by Mr. Feith, and I would like to begin by asking Dr. Bauer exactly how, with the recreations that we have seen, what data do we have available to the board, and could you give us some insight about what data you review in putting together this type of information that we have seen presented?
Yes, sir. I have data available from several different sources. Typically what is used and what we have available in this investigation is data from radar, FAA radar, flight data recorder, cockpit voice recorder, and the air traffic control.
How do you correlate all those data in order to put this information together, and how do you establish these positions and various events that we've seen recreated?
Well, we use the data to establish the position of the aircraft, the timing, and when certain events occur. And we have certain events which are common amongst the different data sources. Each of these data sources, we have a time that we can correlate with, and then we cross-check the data. For example, we have altitudes from both the radar data and the flight data recorder. We cross-check those to make sure they correlate together. We have timing from voice radio communications that are recorded on the cockpit voice recorder, on the air traffic control transcript, and we also have indication of microphone usage on the flight data recorder. We can correlate all of those common events with time. We also compare and make sure that if we have radar from different sites, which we did in this accident, make sure that the information from those radar sites are giving us all the same positions, altitudes, times, etc. As a further check, we can use radar data to calculate speeds, headings of the aircraft, and compare them with flight data recorder. So we have several cross-checks we can use to correlate all this information.
Can you give us some examples of those correlations on this accident?
I certainly can. Do we have a laser pointer available by chance? If we could zoom in on that a little bit. What we have here, Mr. Chairman, is a comparison. This is a ground track of the radar data from two separate independent radar sources.
It's not showing on these screens, so we're going to have to bend around. Excuse us. John, if you don't mind leaning back just a little so we can all see here, because we can't see down there. Okay, go ahead, Dan.
It's a little fuzzy, but as you can see, the round circles on this radar ground track, the ones that are not filled in, hollow, represent the radar data from the Miami Airport Surveillance Radar, which is recorded right at Miami Airport. That data is recorded once every 4.5 seconds, and we're able to get a ground track from that. Overlaid on top of that.
Is this all beacon?
Yes, that's correct.
It's all secondary radar?
Yes, that's correct. This is all radar that included the transponder. Overlaid on top of that, we have data from the Miami Air Route Traffic Control Center, which is an entirely independent radar tracking. And we see that those two ground tracks overlay extremely well. We had extremely good correlation of the position of the aircraft, as well as the altitudes. If we could go on next to the flight data recorder data.
No.
This is an example of some of the correlations we did between the flight data recorder, cockpit voice recorder, and air traffic control communications. If we look on this top line, this is our flight data recorder information indicating when the microphone is keyed. So that gives us an indication of when a transmission is being made. And we can correlate that with the exact time as recorded on the cockpit voice recorder and on the air traffic control when a transmission is being made. And we had very good correlation of all these transmissions that were made by the aircraft from, this is the middle portion of the flight, but all the way back to takeoff. We had extremely good correlation between all the times of the radio transmissions on all three sources.
Dan, would you also mention the Fort Lauderdale radar sensors that we used in this as well?
Yes, that's correct. We actually had radar from three separate independent sensors. We had the radar data from the Miami ASR facility. We had data that was obtained using the Fort Lauderdale Airport ASR. And also, finally, the one that was shown on the previous plot, the NTAP data from the Miami Air Route Traffic Control Center. So we had three separate independent sensors giving us radar data.
So there was some mention of anomalies in the flight data recorder data that was provided, but you were able through these other three radars in order to bring this information together? And
yes, sir, that's correct. If we go on to the next chart, if we bring that visualizer up again. Here we have a plot of, this is our altitude data as a function of time from two separate independent sources, one from the flight data recorder and one from the FDR. We see that we did have, this is our first altitude anomaly we had in the FDR data. And there was a second one here towards the end of the flight. However, prior, leading up to that entire portion, and even during times in between, we had extremely good correlation between the altitudes from the radar and the altitudes from the flight data recorder, which were provided by 2 independent sources.
And how were you able to determine the accident location?
We determined the accident locations. Basically, we had several cross-checks on that. I went out myself and used our Magellan Pro 5000 GPS system receiver to determine an accident location. We had representatives from the Navy, soup salve operation, Oceaneering Technologies. They determined an accident location, compared with us, compared very well. And additionally, we had an independent surveyor on scene who verified our accident location.
And who assisted you with this, Dr. Bowers?
With the accident location determination?
Well, with the information that you presented.
I was assisted with party members from ValuJet Airlines, McDonnell Douglas Corporation, FAA.
And our own internal.
Yes, our own internal staff.
And are you feel comfortable that you have correctly correlated this data?
Yes, sir. We have a lot of data in this accident, and it is all extremely consistent.
Very well. Other questions concerning the accident factual presentation by the staff? Mr. Vice Chairman.
Greg, on the whooshing sound on the CVR, and that was, when you listen to it, was such a predominant noise. And this is one of the few forums where we can speculate on things. I'd be interested if there's something that you think would be constructive for us to know in terms of what folks think that might be. I mean, it really was, it's almost overwhelming at some times, and yet we don't seem to be able to deal with identification.
We had discussed that amongst the staff as to what the sound may have been. We have 4 DC-9 qualified pilots that work for the safety board, and talking with them and using their experiences in the cockpit, we tried to determine if it may have been a window being opened or a cabin door being opened or possibly one of the fans inside the cockpit. We had our CVR specialist, Al Wrighton, go out and do some in-flight testing in an aircraft to record a variety of different sounds, which were then brought back to Washington, and we tried to do a comparison to see if we could match the noise. When we were never able to do it successfully. So while the sound has been described best on the CVR transcript as a loud rushing air noise, we can't actually make that determination whether it was in fact due to an open window or a cabin door being opened.
Did we actually open a window at altitude, 10,000 feet?
No, we did not. But we had information from Douglas Corporation, who had done some in-flight testing with smoke evacuation procedures, and they were able to give us some sound information. And another point, the cockpit window, when it's open, is extremely loud. I mean, it is, you would not hear yourself talk to your partner in the cockpit. Plus, the CVR has the microphone, the CAM, the cockpit area microphone, has a limiting circuit on it. And we did some spectrum analysis of the sounds in the cockpit, and we were able to determine that the CAM did not reach that maximum limit. So if the cockpit window had been open, it probably would have overdriven that microphone, but we were able to make the determination that it had not, because we were also concerned about the fact that during the latter portion of the CVR, the first time before the power interruption, and then when it came back on 1 minute and 12 seconds later, and all we had was the sound of this rushing air noise, we were concerned of the fact that maybe the crew had still been talking to each other, so we wanted to be able to identify if in fact those sounds would have been able to be heard.
Thanks.
Let me, just before we move to Member Hammersmith, ask one other follow-up to that. Are you going to ask about the cockpit voice recorder? Maybe I'm... No. It went off and it comes back on. How do we think that happened? We lost how much? About a minute of it, was it?
Approximately 1 minute and 12 seconds. I can give you a general statement, and if you would like to have more technical information, I'll turn it over to John Clark. But it's my understanding that there was probably either a power down or an actual loss of electrical power to the unit. It takes a certain level of power to drive the unit. and it's a good possibility that there was a power droop or a power interruption because the wire bundle that drives the CVR runs through the tunnel area of the forward cargo area, that it's high likelihood that that wire bundle had been exposed to high heat or fire and may have caused a power disruption.
You have anything to add to that, Mr. Clark?
No, I think that's fine.
Okay, Member Hammersmith?
Two questions. First is, from what information was the last position of the aircraft when it was still in the air derived from?
What we have in the radar data, we do have a transponder return of the aircraft down at 900 feet. That is the last radar return that is definitively with the transponder. After that, we have two additional primary radar returns. And the primary radar returns, they do not include any transponder information. So there's just a reflection off of an object. We do have one which leads right into the accident site, and we do have one that occurs right on the accident site. However, the one that occurs on the accident site, we, through our calculations of airspeed leading up to that point, we feel that that is probably after the accident has occurred and there's some debris rebounding up and being interrogated by the radar.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Bauer, you made reference to this discrepancy in the flight data recorder altitude information. Were you able to determine what could account for that?
Yes, sir. We saw the discrepancy not only in the flight data recorder altitude, but also in the airspeed. That type of discrepancy is consistent with an increase in static source pressure. I believe Dr. Berkey may expand upon that in his presentation. But in both instances, the anomalies are consistent with an increase in static source pressure on the aircraft.
You threw
what could have caused such a pressure differential? Which should...
Merritt, would you like to address that?
Well, the most likely cause of that is a main gear tire rupturing during the fire process.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you. I just wanted to close the loop on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dan, the primary radar, was that off the Miami ASR or Lauderdale? Or
The primary returns we had, those were obtained from the Fort Lauderdale sensor. The Miami sensors did not pick up those primary returns. The final primary returns leading up to the accident site, those were obtained from the Fort Lauderdale sensor.
Do we somehow, or could we confirm that in fact you could see that low on the Lauderdale? I mean, it's obviously very flat terrain.
It is.
There,
it's very flat terrain. We
but
not.
It could see.
We didn't actually confirm, but it only has to be up a few hundred feet for there to be a return.
Thanks.
Member Golia?
Greg, I have a question on the voice recorder. As you know, the DC-9 operates with two independent electrical buses, left and right, and a cross-tie relay. In the event we have a failure of either bus, then both buses can be powered by one generator. When on the voice recorder we hear the crew reporting an electrical problem, did the cockpit voice recorder pick up the cross-tie function? It's rather loud in the cockpit, and there's a master caution and alerts and so on. Were we able to determine any of that from the voice recorder?
There were some noises in the background that were recorded on the cam channel. They were not specifically identified by the group, and so if there was a cross-tie relay tripping or anything like that, it was not specifically identified.
Mr. Fife, for the benefit of our audience, you might explain what the CAM channel is versus other channels.
Once again, the CAM channel is the cockpit area microphone, and what that is a microphone that is positioned in the center of the cockpit that just records everything in the cockpit. That is, whether you're talking in there, whether there are sounds, noises, bells, whistles, it'll record everything that's transpiring in that cockpit. So it's just a general recording of the environment itself.
Thank you.
And we have no indication at all that we could determine that there was a cross-tie event happening.
It is my understanding, based on the CVR group's work, that there was nothing that was specifically identified.
Mr. Clark?
The CVR transcript shows no notation of a bus transfer, and it's not unusual for us to hear that and see that and have that noted in the CVR transcript. So the record of the recording didn't provide us information to come to that conclusion and put that in the transcript.
Okay, thank you.
Member Black?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Just a clarification on something. There were actually two inconsistencies, Dan, in the FDR on altitude. There were the pressure pulses that I think John Hammerschmidt was talking about. Then, at some point during the descent, the transponder altitude and the gauge reading altitude differed also. Would you like to comment on those, or maybe put the chart back up?
Certainly. Stand by.
Also, Dan, would you comment on a possible reason for that difference between the two?
Certainly. Will you be referring to this section right here, Member Black?
Yes, sir. I think it was 200 feet or so.
This was it averaged about a 280 feet difference. It varied somewhat. But again, this was another indication of a slight increase in the static source pressure, since there was a slight anomaly in the airspeed information also. This, again, is from a static source, and we did find evidence in the wreckage of an outflow of soot from one of the static sources. So this would possibly, which indicates a breach in that static source line. This portion right here could be consistent with a breach in that static line, hence the flight data recorder sensing the static pressure at the breach as opposed to external of the aircraft, since we do have evidence that there was a breach in that static line by the outflow of soot from that static source. So this could be an indication of a breach in that static source line.
So that's independent evidence of fire damage, in other words.
That's correct.
And there are two different sources, one for the transponder and another for the what I'll call the gauge altimeter, the cockpit altimeter reading, which is what the FDR would be reading. Is that correct?
Actually, the FDR obtains its static source from the alternate static source. In this other transponder information, it's either from one of the two air data computers, depending on what switch is switched in the cockpit for the transponder. We did not have any information to determine which air data computer the transponder was switched to, but these are two totally separate independent static sources.
But the transponder is also confirmed by height elevation from, you had some checks against that with radar, did you not?
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Member Golia has one more.
Dan, it's for you. Which static source did we find soot in?
We found soot in the alternate static source.
Which is on the left side of the airplane?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Feith, one final question from the chairman before we move into the issues. From the cockpit voice recorder, flight data recorder information, were we able to ascertain at how long either member of the flight crew was able to fly the airplane?
We had discussed this at length in the report amongst the staff, and in looking at the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder information, because of the lack of communication between the two crew members in the cockpit and the lack of flight data recorder information at the very end of the flight, it was not determined exactly if flight control inputs were being made. We do have radar data that gives us position of the airplane, flight path across the ground, and where the accident happened. But we don't have definitive information about flight control inputs. We do know that there were inputs being made throughout the majority of the flight, but in the last minute or so of flight, we don't know exactly what kind of control inputs.
We do not know whether that was controlled flight or not.
Well, Ben Berman will be addressing that issue more when you get to the agenda item number 2, I believe it is. So he's prepared to deal with that a little bit more in some greater specifics.
Okay.
One other point I'd like to make, that Dr. Berkey mentioned the tire as being the source, the rupture of the tire and the loss of air from the tire as being the source of the disturbance from the static port that led to the first anomaly in the airspeed and altitude. What he meant to say, and he will talk about this more in his discussion of the next agenda item, is that was a tire that was carried in the cargo compartment as comat that in the process of the fire heated up and ruptured. I just want to make that clear for the record.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
At the end, another question, because I believe it's significant. With the soot that was found on what maintenance people commonly call the salt shaker, the static port, the routing of the tubing inside the airplane. Now, I don't know how to ask this question because I know the answer. I could make a statement, but can you share for the audience where the static port is located on the left side of the airplane?
We could, Mr. Swaim, the systems group chairman, has a graphic which may illustrate that.
Is that going to be part of Dr. Berkey's presentation? No.
No.
Okay.
Well,
Can we get that graphic up?
That's fine.
There's the graphic on the viewer now. Dave, if you could raise that a little bit and zoom in on the dashed line in the lower right. Where's that? Approximately down here in the lower left side of the aircraft is where the static port is that we found with the soot trail. The static port is at about station 341. The line is routed up and aft slightly. It's drawn a little generically and then comes
What
up.
does station 341 mean? Is that the front or back of the plane? What are we looking at?
That's partway through the forward cargo compartment, 341 inches from the nose of the airplane.
Thank you.
The strut which supports the floorboards on this side, about 10 inches after that, is where the line would route up, and then it routes across the floor beam and forward toward the cockpit and the other places it has to go.
So the routing is from about the center of the cargo compartment.
Slightly forward of, yes.
Okay. And up the sidewall for a short distance, and then forward towards the electronics bay.
That's correct.
Right. Thank you.
Vice Chairman has a question.
Yeah, I think this would be for Merritt. On the oxygen canisters, we talk a lot about the caps and the lanyards. And I think we made some reference to this in the report, but I think it's important to get your feeling on if the cap, in fact, is the safety cap, in fact, is on, does that mean that it is not possible to, if you pull on the lanyard, not possible to ignite the canister?
Vice Chairman Francis, I think these are the things exactly that Merritt is going to be talking about in his presentation, and maybe this would be a good time for him to start that and then answer your question as a part of that, since that's what he's going to be talking about.
Okay. Before we get into that now, are there any final questions here before we move into the discussion of the safety issues? As a word of explanation to the audience, the Congress mandates NTSB to investigate these accidents for the purpose of making recommendations to prevent a similar accident from happening in the future. We have discussed, had a presentation of the facts of the accident. Now staff is presenting 8 different safety issues for consideration by the board members. We're going to begin our discussion of those 8 issues, which of course will obviously refer back to factual information that was already generated as part of the accident investigation. Some of the board members may have additional issues they want discussed, but the first thing we will do is go through the 8 issues that have been presented for discussion by staff. The first of which is the minimization of hazards posed by fires in Class D cargo compartments. I believe Dr. Berkey is making that presentation. Dr. Berkey, please proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman, board members, and ladies and gentlemen. One of the fundamental issues in this accident is the absence of an early smoke and fire detection and suppression system in Class D cargo compartments in passenger airplanes. On 2 separate occasions in the past, the Safety Board has recommended to the Federal Aviation Administration that smoke and fire suppression systems be required in such cargo compartments. The first occasion was in 1981 after an in-flight fire aboard a Saudi Arabian airline TriStar L-1011 in 1980, in which 301 fatalities occurred. The FAA decided after fire testing that the cargo liners should be upgraded to more fire-resistant material and that smoke detectors and fire suppression systems were not necessary. The second time the Safety Board recommended this technology in Class D cargo compartments occurred in 1988 after an in-flight fire on an American Airlines MD-80 series airplane that resulted from the release of hydrogen peroxide in the cargo compartment. After issuing a notice of proposed rulemaking based on the Safety Board's recommendation for this technology, the FAA decided 5 years after this accident that a cost-benefit analysis did not justify the addition of fire detection and suppression technology to Class D cargo compartments on passenger airplanes. Consequently, the Safety Board classified these recommendations as closed, unacceptable action. Investigation of the in-flight fire on ValuJet 592 showed that a fire started in the forward cargo compartment that burned through the ceiling into the passenger compartment. The investigation showed that the fire was initiated by 1 or more oxygen generators that was accidentally triggered when the firing mechanism was not properly secured. The high temperatures produced when the oxygen generator is activated ignited the wrapping material in the presence of high oxygen concentrations, which produced a very rapid developing and extremely hot fire. Photograph 1 shows some of the oxygen generators that were recovered from the Everglades, and photograph 2 shows a close-up of one generator with parts from a second generator. As noted in this photograph, the fire has consumed part of the outer stainless steel case of this particular generator. Some of the earliest hardware retrieved from the Everglades that was carried in the forward cargo compartment were 2 burned main gear tires. The one main gear tire that was found without a wheel had parts of an oxygen generator inside the casing. The third photograph shows the tire that was mounted on a wheel that is ruptured in this area. The next photograph shows a close-up of that area where the tire was ruptured. The conclusions about the origin of this fire and fire growth are consistent with other hardware retrieved during the investigation, including melted floor beams, fire damage to electrical cables above and to the left of the forward cargo compartment, and control cable fire damage. There was no significant fire damage to other aircraft systems. The events recorded on the CVR and FDR are also consistent with this fire scenario. 6 minutes after takeoff, there was an unidentified sound on the CVR and an FDR anomaly at 14:10:03, that's already been mentioned by Dr. Bauer, that was most likely caused by the rupture of the inflated tire that was in the forward cargo compartment, shown in the previous photograph. About 5 seconds later, the captain is aware of an electrical problem. And 18 seconds later, fire is reported in the passenger compartment. The fundamental problem was a lack of early detection and suppression. Early detection of the fire would have given the flight crew sufficient time to get the aircraft on the ground before the flight control systems were compromised. A suppression system would have either extinguished or delayed fire development, giving the crew more time to safely land and evacuate the aircraft. As a result of this accident, the FAA issued a notice of proposed rulemaking on June 13, 1997, to require smoke and fire suppression systems for Class D cargo compartments in passenger aircraft. FAA staff stated that the regulation requiring the addition of these systems to all Class D cargo compartments on passenger aircraft will be in place by the end of the year. In addition, Delta and ValuJet initiated programs to add these fire protective systems to their aircraft Class D compartments. During the investigation of this accident, the Safety Board set up a fire test in cooperation with the Federal Aviation Administration Technical Center in Atlantic City. I'd like to, with your permission, Mr. Chairman, show you a very short edited video of these fire tests that I think demonstrate the hazard of carrying these generators in cargo compartments on aircraft.
Again, before we show this video, if any of the audience desires to exit, we'll give you time to do so. If not, please proceed. Dr. Berkey.
If you could start the video. This is a setup which we have 5 boxes of oxygen generators, 24 generators in each box. They're in the white boxes here, and we have a main gear tire that was pressurized to 50 psi, and we put luggage around the oxygen containing generator boxes. The fire is triggered. Right here is a thermocouple and a detector to measure heat release, and this would be roughly the height of the cabin, the cargo compartment in a Class D compartment in an MD-80 series aircraft. As you can see, the fire is growing very rapidly. This is an edited version. Within about 10 minutes of the start of this fire, we had temperatures above 3,000 degrees at this temperature sensor here. And each time you see sparks going out, that's another oxygen generator being consumed. We do have a sound on that that's not being transmitted very well. What we did here is try to simulate in a very rough way what the conditions would have been on the MD-80 aircraft, this visualization. That sound is the oxygen generators releasing their oxygen under these higher temperatures. We have the tire here, which will get involved in the fire shortly. And the tire does rupture as a result of the high temperatures during the sequence of events. And you'll see, that was the tire rupturing, and then we believe that was the mechanism that triggered the anomaly in the flight data recorder, and also was simultaneously recorded a comment from the captain of the aircraft on the CVR. Now, this fire was effectively extinguished by the use of an automatic suppression system, so we're pretty sure such a system would have been effective in reducing this fire. I would like to try to comment on the Vice Chairman's question. I believe that yes, had those caps been plastic caps been over the triggering mechanism, it would have prevented the normal triggering of those oxygen generators. Now, if there was a force exerted on them greater than the 1 to 4 pounds I think Greg referred to as a normal activation energy, you could have, I assume, split the cap. But generally, yes, it would have protected.
I would, before we begin, like to note for the public record on page 175 of the report, there is a footnote in regard to the fire tests that you have just watched, and the footnote read as follows. The tests were not designed to be an exact replication or simulation of the circumstances of the ValuJet accident, but were conducted to learn about the overall nature of a fire initiated by an oxygen generator and fed with high concentration of oxygen released from additional oxygen generators. Because the investigation could not conclusively determine the exact physical arrangement of the generators in each box, the exact size of the boxes, the exact arrangement of the boxes and tires in the cargo compartment, or how many oxygen generators were initially activated, and because of differences between the test chamber and the accident cargo compartment, the Safety Board recognizes that the test results might differ somewhat from what occurred on the accident airplane. I had some just brief questions before I turn to the other members of the board. Mr. Berkey or Mr. Sweedler, could you please tell me, was there any fatalities in the 1988 American Airlines accident?
There were not, Mr. Chairman.
No.
Could you tell us a little more about that accident? Whoever would be appropriate.
Bob Chipkovich would be probably the most appropriate
Mr. Chipovich, were you there for the investigation of that accident?
Yes, sir, I was.
And you had a hand in the recommendations?
Yes, sir.
If you could explain us a little about that 1988 accident, please.
Yes, sir. On approach to Nashville, Tennessee, it was an American Airlines MD-80 en route from Dallas-Fort Worth. They had a fire on board in the cargo compartment, which was also a Class D cargo compartment. Flight crew did not have any indication or information about a fire in the cargo compartment until smoke was detected inside the passenger cabin and the information relayed to the crew flying the airplane. Airplane did land safely. Passengers were evacuated from the aircraft. Fire was determined to be caused by hydrogen peroxide, an oxidizer that was an undeclared hazardous material shipment that was loaded onto the aircraft. The Safety Board determined in the accident investigation report that the hydrogen peroxide had leaked and started a fire in the cargo compartment. As a result of the accident investigation, the board recommended that the FAA require fire detection, fire and smoke detection systems in all Class D cargo compartments, as well as fire suppression systems.
Mr. Chipovich, is undeclared hazardous material shipment something that rarely occurs? Is that something that, could you give us some history of the occurrence of that on commercial aircraft in the United States, and who has the responsibility for keeping that information?
Because undeclared hazardous material is not normally identified unless a package breaks open or the material leaks out, there's no data to tell us exactly how much is in the system. The FAA is responsible for the oversight or the regulation of hazardous materials by air. And most of their enforcement work has involved cases involving undeclared hazardous materials after they have been identified by air carriers because packages have broken open or leaked. And
my understanding from information you provided me that last year, in 1995, there was over 14 billion ton miles of air freight that was sent in the U.S. That is there's a 7% annual growth of that. The hazardous materials freight by air is estimated between 2 and 3% of that, and 60% of that total moves on passenger carriers. And that in 1995, the last year you had information for me, there were about 800 incidents that had been reported by the FAA of undeclared hazmat being carried. Is that all correct information?
Yes, sir.
And I guess it was on the basis of that information the Safety Board made its recommendations in 1988.
Yes, sir. And addressed in the Nashville report was the problem in particular with undeclared hazardous materials being a problem.
And I believe one final item that I would like to put on the record is that I think in 1995 the FAA collected $1,554,575 as penalties from some of the carriers for hazardous unauthorized carrying or transport or handling of hazardous materials. Is that correct information as well?
Yes, sir.
Very well. Now, one last item, Dr. Berkey, and that is there has been some people who have felt that this fire might have started as part of a problem with the electrical system of the airplane, because the airplane had some history of electrical problems. Now, you have come to the conclusion that this started in the cargo compartment. Now, I would like you to explain to me the best you can why you think it started in the cargo compartment and why it didn't start in the electrical system. And maybe Mr. Feith or somebody could give us a little history on that airplane and the problems with the electrical system.
Yes, I would be most happy to address that issue. One of the major reasons we did the three-dimensional mock-up, and I think we have a more detailed view of the three-dimensional mock-up of the forward cargo compartment. This is a forward end of the aircraft, and this is the forward cargo compartment. This is the electrical cables that were installed in what they call the cheek area, or tunnel, as some people will refer to it. And Bob Swain can talk more about those electrical systems if we need to, but basically what
we're looking at is
this is a three-dimensional mock-up that was done at Tamiami Airport.
From the aircraft itself?
From the parts from the aircraft, correct. And you notice that this is a forward fiberglass insulation on the forward end of the cargo compartment. It is basically unfire damaged, and just forward of this is the electrical bay of the aircraft. The only serious fire damage we have is after that, just forward of the main cargo door on the right side. If a fire had started here, the fire is unlikely to propagate down in that time period. So we know that the fire started here lower than the electrical cables. There's more evidence of the fire damage if you look at the next photograph, which shows a seat. This was roughly where the tires were, right? Starting here is a cargo door on the right side. And this is a fire damage on the fiberglass insulation in the aircraft in the forward cargo compartment. Then up here we start going into the transition into the ceiling or floor beams for the floor, in which we had extensive melting of those floor beams. I think the next...
what type of heat does it take to melt the beams?
Well, those are aluminum, so it takes about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The next, I think, shows a...
Dr. Berkey, what side of the airplane are you showing here?
This is the left side over here.
Thank you.
That's correct. This is left. And the forward is to my right, to your left. Yes. The next... here. The next two photographs will show the evidence of the melting that was noted on the seat track. This is a seat track just above the area we're talking about in the cabin.
Do we believe this to be the left side also?
This is on the this is almost midsection to the left, just to the left for the seat track. Left on the left aisle, left side of the aisle. And this is what we refer to in the fire area as what we call broom strawing. That is, the aluminum has gotten to the melting point, and then it's been shocked either by impact or some other, which gives you the appearance of a broom because aluminum just sprays out and then solidifies in the process. So this was taken from the was located originally in the cabin area of the aircraft. I think the next slide, photograph, is another piece of a seat track. Yes, that also shows the evidence of melting. The other thing that stands out about this this fire, why I conclude it's not related to electrical, is an extremely rapidly developing fire as a result of high concentrations of oxygen, in which you end up having temperatures high enough and enough oxygen to burn the stainless steel oxygen generator cases. And we saw that in the fire test as well. So there's all kinds of evidence to validate the cause of this fire is the oxygen generators and not an electrical problem.
What is the operating temperature or the temperature that would be required to significantly damage a stainless steel container?
Well, to prevent damage?
No, the oxygen generators you mentioned were damaged in the test.
I'm sorry.
The oxygen generators you mentioned with the stainless steel material that represents the outer case of the oxygen generator was damaged. What kind of temperatures does it take to damage a stainless steel?
We're talking about 2,000 degrees above.
And in the course of a normal fire, with the types of goods one would normally see in a cargo compartment, a baggage compartment, in other words, clothes and personal effects, what kind of temperatures would you normally expect to see?
Well, I have to qualify that a little bit, but generally it wouldn't be as high as we're seeing here. But when you have, if you have an airstream going over it, like an open, if the aircraft had been breached in some way, then you get fairly high temperatures with high air flowing over it. But inside a closed container, it shouldn't be more than about 1,200 degrees.
Thank you.
Merrick, just to
move to the Vice Chairman for his questions.
Conclude on the issue of, in addition to the oxygen generators, we obviously also looked at the circuit breaker panels, and there was no evidence of electrical problems as far as what we were able to recover of the aircraft.
That is correct. There's no evidence of a fire on any other systems or electrical problem in the circuit breakers. Correct.
Do you have additional information, Dr. Loeb, Ms. Fite?
I was just going to expound on the fact that we made that a point to look for the right auxiliary hydraulic system circuit breaker panel, because that was one of the MEL items that we were aware of, and we had heard some information about the work and problems having reset the circuit breaker. So Mr. Swaim, in his examination, was able to determine that there was no evidence of arcing or sooting or fire, and he can give you a further explanation if you need it.
Very well. Mr. Berkey, Dr. Berkey, who assisted you at your party group?
Well, the FAA, Dave Blake was there, also ValuJet and SaberTech and McDonnell Douglas.
Did any of those individuals, did they all agree with your the presentation that's made here this morning?
Yes, sir.
Very well. Vice Chairman. Member Hammersmith.
Well, we're on a subject area entitled the minimization of hazards posed by fires in Class D cargo compartments. Would someone, for the benefit of the audience, please describe exactly what is a Class D cargo compartment? What differentiates it from other types of cargo compartments aboard airliners?
Class D is classified as less than 1,000 cubic feet, or equivalent, or less than 1,000 cubic feet. And the procedure, yeah, that's in page 47 here. The procedure, the philosophy has been in Class D cargo compartments is that the fire is controlled by limited ventilation in those in Class D compartments to prevent fire development, as compared to Class A, which is really just a luggage compartment. Class B is a cargo and baggage compartment, but usually, and Class D is for cargo aircraft only. I'm sorry, Class C, I beg your pardon.
The Class A cargo is a compartment in which you can get to it with an extinguisher and address it. Class B is not. It does require separate smoke detector or fire detector systems. Class C also requires that. Class D doesn't, as Dr. Berkey indicated. It's hardened and to prevent, first of all, ventilation, and also to retard fire from getting out of the compartment.
Member Hammersmith, it's my understanding that there are 2,800 passenger planes. The latest information we got from the FAA was there were 2,800 passenger planes, 685 cargo planes, for a total of 3,485 planes with the Class D cargo compartments.
And again, for the record and for the audience, what models of aircraft contain or have Class D cargo compartments?
I have that information here.
What do you mean, what models?
Like DC-9, 727?
Yeah.
Does someone have a concise list of that?
Well, unfortunately, the chairman does. It's 727s, 737s have Class Ds, as well as the MD 80, 90, 95, and DC-9s.
I think it's all the narrow bodies aircraft,
Yeah, all
basically.
the narrow body passenger aircraft.
There's one comment that needs to be made with this, that the manufacturers have delivered those model airplanes that have Class C compartments. That is, those that have fire detection and fire suppression. To my knowledge, they've only been delivered to operators outside of the United States. But there are some of those model airplanes that are presently equipped with both detection and suppression. It was available as an option.
Thank you. I believe Dr. Berkey in his presentation made reference to the fact that ValuJet and Delta Airlines are currently working on some systems for protection of their Class D cargo compartments. Could someone bring us up to date on what the progress has been in that area?
Member Hammerschmidt, we received a letter from ValuJet dated August 18th, and it was addressed to the chairman, regarding an announcement that they were making that they had received provisional supplemental type certificate for a smoke detection system that they intend to install on their DC-9 aircraft, and that they are currently working on a fire suppression system and hoping to have certification approval for that in the very near future, which they intend to then begin installing probably in September on all of their aircraft. So they have received the FAA's initial approval to put this type of system on their aircraft. Delta has also been working towards the same goal of getting a type certificate for installation of a different type of smoke detector and suppression system. There are two different companies, and that is in the works.
Yeah, Delta's they've passed all the tests, done all of the paperwork, and are now just in the process of getting the STC approved, which is what the ValuJet just got within the last week.
And to sum it up, Delta and ValuJet have made significant progress in this general area of fire protection in these Class D cargo compartments in advance of anticipated regulatory measures.
Delta Airlines began their program early in the year in January, shortly after the ATA had committed in November that they would have their ATA members voluntarily work on this type of program. Delta went ahead and initiated it, and they were the only one at the time. ValuJet then followed suit shortly thereafter, and ValuJet was able to receive the STC at this point.
The chairman asked and made reference to the February 88 American Airlines accident that landed at Nashville, Tennessee, in which the board issued formal safety recommendations to the FAA concerning Class D cargo compartments, and the board's serious concern about those cargo compartments in terms of fire safety. But that was not the first time that the board had visited that particular issue. There was an August 1980 accident in Saudi Arabia involving an L-1011 that the safety board participated in the investigation. Could someone on staff go into a little more detail as to what our expressed concerns were in terms of recommendations and what the follow-up was by the Federal Aviation Administration?
Yeah. Merritt, you want to?
Who's going to take that, Dr. Loeb?
Barry Sweedler will be.
Need to have somebody with gray hair or no hair.
Mr. Chairman, Member Hammerschmidt, you asked about the 1980 Saudia fire and what happened, what transpired after that. After that investigation that we participated in under Annex 13, we made two recommendations in 1981. One was to evaluate the Class D certification of the L-1011 C3 cargo compartment with a view toward either changing the classification to C, which would have a suppression and detection system, which would require detection and extinguishing equipment, or changing the compartment line of material to ensure containment of a fire of the types likely in the compartment while in flight. That was the first recommendation. The second recommendation was to review the classification of all baggage cargo compartments over 500 cubic feet in Class D classification to ensure that the intent of the regulations were met. Basically, the FAA undertook a research project to determine the best course of action, and the decision at that time was to change the line of material from the material Nomex to a fiberglass material. And I think, as Dr. Berkey described, in this particular accident that we're talking about today, the fiberglass material was the material that was installed. And based on the way the wording of our recommendation was made, we had indicated they could do either or. We eventually did close that recommendation as both of those recommendations as acceptable action.
All right, now our second recommendation, which we issued on February the 10th, 1981, along with the other recommendation, of course, and not to belabor the point, but it says, review the certification of all baggage cargo compartments in the Class D classification to ensure that the intent of 14 CFR 25.857D is met. And when we go to that regulation on page 47, Class D cargo or baggage compartment is one in which, one, a fire occurring in it will be completely confined without endangering the safety of the airplane or the occupants. Number two, there are means to exclude hazardous quantities of smoke, flames, or other noxious gases from any compartment occupied by the crew or passengers. And three, ventilation and drafts are controlled within each compartment so that any fire likely to occur in the compartment will not progress beyond safe limits. Do you feel as though the FAA in response to our recommendation adequately studied that issue back in the early 80s? Do you feel that was, when they say that they did a study and then they took a certain course of action, do you think that their study was valid?
We did have some concerns about it, although we closed the recommendation as an acceptable action because of the way in which we worded and so forth. There were some concerns that we had that were expressed back to the FAA. Although they went to the fiberglass lining, they still used aluminum for fittings and attachments. We had concerns about that because of the low temperatures at which aluminum would melt. Once you melt the aluminum, the fiberglass is no longer providing a barrier. So there were some concerns that we had expressed about that, and at the same time, during some of the work that was done by the FAA in support, there were internally concerns expressed about the very same issue. I think that Bob Chipkovich can elaborate even more on that for you.
There were a couple of concerns that the Safety Board did make to the FAA while they were looking at improving the Class D cargo compartment. And one was that in the rulemaking, excuse me, they did not consider the effect of hazardous materials in the cargo compartment and involved in a fire in a cargo compartment, which the board made comments and felt that certainly should be considered. And second, in the American Airlines incident, we did note that an aluminum supports that held the fiberglass panels together did in fact melt because of the heat and allow then the smoke and heat to escape the compartment where the aluminum support straps held together, and did express again our concerns about the capability of that compartment to contain a fire.
If I may add, the philosophy that was used in here was to control fires by limiting ventilation, and when you have an oxidizer on board, of course, that philosophy no longer applies. The other thing we said when we closed out the 1981 recommendation is that we stated that no fire should persist in any state of intensity without the knowledge of the flight crew. And fire detection should be required in Class D compartments. So we had real concerns back in 81 and later than as a result of this experience.
Thank you, Dr. Berkey. I think it would be fair to say that that very specific, technical, detailed concerns about the safety of Class D cargo compartments have been expressed by this agency, the NTSB, to the FAA for at least 15 years prior to this ValuJet accident. That's all I have.
Member Golea?
I have a couple of questions quickly. Mr. Fife, is Mr. Swain going to be making a presentation? I have some questions around the circuit breakers. And
No, he's not. Why don't you ask him now? I think it'd be entirely appropriate.
in referencing to the hydraulic pump circuit breakers, that in reviewing the records, I see that we have a history of resetting those circuit breakers that go back at least to the December prior to the accident. Did we do a detailed analysis on those circuit breakers?
We examined the circuit breakers in the panel. Photographs are included in the docket in the factual reports, front, rear. We did a basic electric ohmmeter check, but we did not take them to the laboratory, basically because we found nothing wrong with the circuit breaker as far as external arcing, heat damage in the area. We had looked at the wiring as it ran through the tunnel area next to the cargo compartment, and as Dr. Berkey pointed out, the cargo liner effectively not only keeps the heat in the compartment, but if we had a fire originated in the wiring, we would have had more damage outside of the compartment. The cargo liner would have kept the fire out before it had penetrated inward. So for those reasons, no, we did not take the circuit breaker to a laboratory, just simply because of the maintenance write-ups.
Okay, thank you. And I guess my other question, since we're talking about the source of the fire, I guess would go to Greg and then maybe someone else. My memory drew me back to the ADs on this airplane, as I remember spending a portion of my prior life working in the forward bag bin on longitudinal relays because there was an AD note issued concerning fire. McDonnell Douglas and the FAA have been very concerned over the possibility of these trim relays causing a fire. Did you do any work in this area?
Yes, sir, we did, and Bob could probably elaborate further, but we were aware of the AD at the time when we examined.
You might explain what an AD is.
I'm sorry. It is an airworthiness directive that was issued by the FAA regarding this relay that you're talking about. The relay is located on the right side of the cargo compartment itself, forward of the door. And given the fact that when Merritt examined the wreckage and the cargo compartment itself, the concentration of fire was on the left side, but we wanted to look at the entire cargo compartment. We did, in fact, find the relay itself. There was evidence of melted plastic, but it was such that it was probably residual heat from the fire in the compartment itself, and not the relay being the source of the fire. But we were aware of the AD. We did examine it for the possibility that that could have been a source for the fire.
Okay. I'll hold the other questions. Thank you very much.
Member Black?
No questions.
Very well. Shall we proceed before we break into the second issue and try to complete that, and then we'll take a break?
Sure.
Issue number 2 is the equipment, training, and procedures for addressing in-flight smoke and fire aboard air carrier airplanes.
Ben Berman will handle that.
Mr. Berman, would you please proceed?
Good morning. This issue area relates to the flight crew's actions and the procedures and equipment that was provided to the crew to help them deal with the situation in which they found themselves. According to the cockpit voice recorder transcript, the captain made an immediate decision to return to Miami and began a descent immediately. The radar data showed that the flight continued away from Miami for about 80 seconds, following vectors from air traffic control. During this period, the flight crew was contending with the progressive degradation of aircraft structure and flight controls, beginning with the electrical problems, which we've already discussed extensively here, continuing with the development in which the left engine power could not be reduced, and then continuing with the uncommanded pitch up in which the airplane's nose came up quite suddenly, and you can see on the flight data recorder a response by the flight crew in pushing forward on the control column to recover control and then bring the airplane to a level off at 9,500 feet. Also during this period, the flight attendant opened the cockpit door, and this had the unfortunate effect of removing the main smoke barrier between the cabin and the cockpit. the probable reason for her opening the door was that her cockpit to, or cabin to cockpit interphone was inoperative on this flight and had been deferred in accordance with the FAA approved minimum equipment list that prescribes the items of equipment that can be inoperative on a dispatched flight. Opening the cockpit door may have introduced smoke into the cockpit, but no coughing sounds were recorded on the, such as that one, were recorded on the cockpit voice recorder. And also in inspection of the wreckage at the accident site, light sooting was found on the cockpit items that were recovered. So this action of the flight attendant to open the door probably did not admit much smoke into the cockpit area at that time. But the mere fact that the flight attendant was forced to open the cockpit door raises serious question of whether minimum equipment lists should permit operating a flight with an inoperative interphone, the only means of communication from cabin to cockpit without opening the door. Now, about 2 minutes and 30 seconds after the emergency began, the flight crew initiated a further left turn, and the airplane descended rapidly then and turned steeply to the left, as the animation showed. Considering the time period between when the emergency began up through the next 3 minutes and 10 seconds, there is evidence that the airplane was at least under partial control by the flight crew. And this is shown by the performance study conducted by Safety Board staff, Dr. Bauer leading that effort, showing that the flight crew would have had to have been making control inputs to make the airplane fly through the positions that it did fly on its way through the gradual descent and then the steep descent portion, all the way through to a pull-up at the bottom of the steep descent. About 8 seconds prior to the impact, during this pull-up and the rollout from the steep left turn, it appears that control was lost. This was most likely from the degradation of the flight controls, as was shown by the melted and collapsed cabin floor beams above the cargo compartment where many flight control cables are located. But we were unable to exclude the possibility that the flight crew was incapacitated at the very end of this sequence, near the end of the flight. We wanted to turn to a consideration of the smoke goggles and oxygen masks that were provided to the flight crew. Based on the cockpit voice recorder transcript, there's no evidence that oxygen masks or smoke goggles were donned. Now, they may have been donned after the time that the recording devices failed, but we have no evidence of that one way or the other. The flight crew's need to don their masks and goggles was somewhat unclear at the beginning of the sequence. Based on the evidence that we discussed, it didn't look like much smoke was introduced right at the beginning, if any. So the goggles and masks were probably not required right away, but they may have been helpful later in the sequence. Emergency procedures provided to the flight crews specify that they should don masks and goggles immediately to be able to see and breathe. And this is particularly given to them as a procedure because it is hard to do it later when you may suddenly need the protection of the masks and goggles from an influx of smoke or poisonous gases. Our review of the circumstances of this accident, as well as surveys we conducted of air carrier, flight crews, and training officials, has given us concerns about the time and effort that are required to don most of the smoke goggles that are given to air carrier flight crews throughout the industry on most aircraft types. And we're also concerned that the FAA has not established any standards for the time required or for the quick donning of smoke goggles, as they have for oxygen masks. And such a standard would ensure that goggles can be donned in a timely manner through either improved equipment such as a single-piece mask and goggles that can all be donned quickly, immediately, as one action, or by improved training for flight crews, or both. We want to review very quickly some new technologies and procedures that are there to be considered. First of all, the single-piece mask and goggles that we've already discussed. But also there do exist emergency vision devices that might be helpful in certain circumstances. We don't believe in this circumstance. There also are some new research conducted at this time by NASA and other parties in the issue of passenger protection from toxic cabin atmospheres. As well, aircraft manufacturers have created some cabin smoke removal procedures which have not been implemented widely in the air carrier industry. And we can discuss for you some of the pros and cons of those procedures and describe them to you if you wish. I'd be glad to take your questions on this issue area right now.
Thank you, Mr. Berman. The first thing I'd like to discuss is I asked staff to get me the MEL list on the DC-9, and my understanding is that there were 3 MEL items that were noted before this flight took off from Miami returning to Atlanta. Could Mr. Fife, could you just briefly mention those 3?
The 3 MEL items involve the cockpit interphone being inoperative, which we've talked about in our concerns regarding that. One was the autopilot. There had been several write-ups about the autopilot. When they engaged it, the airplane would what they call porpoise or bounce up and down and not be able to hold altitude, so they eventually wrote it up and MEL'd that. And there was a left fuel flow gauge that was inoperative. That was also inop and marked inop. These things were looked at, and if you want any further detail, I'm sure that that either Ben or Kurt can answer those questions for you.
I want to focus on the flight interphone. Other members may have other areas of Mr. Berman's presentation they wanted to get into, but the flight interphone, the MEL states in it that the MEL must not deviate from the aircraft flight manual limitations, emergency procedures, or with airworthiness directives. Mr. Berman, could you or either Ms. Marshall tell me, you know, exactly what were the emergency procedures established by ValuJet and approved by the FAA for communication between the cockpit and the cabin attendants in an emergency such as this?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that in the public hearing they asked this question of the POI and were told that the crew would establish the procedures at the time that the MEL item went into effect. The POI gave an example of one method would be that they would have a signal where a flight attendant would knock on the door.
Was there a procedure established by ValuJet in writing in a manual, and was that part of their training?
Not in the flight attendant manual, and I don't believe it was in the pilot procedures either.
How would if they weren't trained for it and it wasn't in the manual, how are they going to know what they're supposed to do?
Well, and I think this is typical of the entire industry. It is up to the crew at the time to determine.
Well, you mean at the time the fire's already started,
no,
they're going to make decisions on emergency procedures?
No, sir. The time to establish those procedures is when the MEL item is established. In other words, when the interphone is written up as inoperative, at that time, the crew is supposed to establish a procedure that they will use to communicate in the absence of the interphone.
So in other words, this was an MEL item. The flight interphone didn't work, which meant there was no way other than the PA system for the crew and the cabin attendants and the flight crew to communicate. Is that correct?
That's correct. And entering the cockpit, which of course
and
then
opening the door.
Right.
Now, is there training not to open the door in case of a fire in the ValuJet manual?
Yes, the flight attendant procedures are that they are not to open the cockpit door if a fire or toxic smoke is present in the forward cabin.
And yet in this case, the door was open.
Correct.
We know from the cockpit voice recorder. But there was, although that was in writing in the ValuJet manual, there was no reference to the alternate procedures to be established by the crew if this flight interphone was inoperative.
Correct.
Vice Chairman?
Yeah, the issue of the donning of the smoke mask is a sensitive issue, and I acknowledge, I guess, that they didn't don the masks as the emergency procedure calls for. On the other hand, I think that since this accident, I've probably talked to 30 or 40 flight crews in various times that I've been in airplanes. And they are not wont, I think it is fair to say, to put smoke masks on very early, even if there is smoke evident in the aircraft. And I think that it's important for us to recognize this when we're dealing with this accident. I think it would be unfortunate if there's an implication here that we're being critical of what this crew did or didn't do, because they are dealing with a situation, and we are sitting here with the benefits of 20/20 hindsight a year later. I think that the important thing, as Ben mentions, is that we look at the issue of how can we make better the oxygen mask goggles situation so that it's a more attractive thing to put on, and it is not viewed by crews, and in fact is not a hindrance rather than a help in terms of the control of the aircraft. I mean, that's what crews will tell you. They'll say, you know, you put on the oxygen mask and they can know that cuts down their communication abilities. It's claustrophobic to some. There are a lot of downsides to putting on oxygen masks and goggles. So I think that number one, it's important that we try to focus on what we can do to make it a better system. One of the pilots, and I'd solicit Ben's reaction to this, or I don't know whether if we've got a Dave Ivey or anyone else here that are DC-9 pilots, but one of the pilots that I talked to, who was a training pilot for a major carrier, said that if he got into a situation where smoke was really becoming an issue in the aircraft, he would have one pilot, either himself or the other pilot, put on the oxygen mask initially and leave the other pilot with more freedom to maneuver. I don't know what your reaction to that would be, but I do think that this is a sufficiently complicated situation that it's worth some discussion.
Yes, sir. I think your comments are confirmed by the survey work that we did in preparation for our review of the issue here today. There's a plus in putting on the masks and goggles, and there's a plus in putting them on quickly because you'll prevent yourself from being overcome later. But we need to recognize that there's a downside to donning this equipment. As you mentioned, communications are interrupted. It's difficult to see through the current generation of goggles, except for the very newest equipment, which are the single-piece ones. And perhaps most important, when you devote some attention and time and effort to fiddling with your goggles and setting the straps, you're not doing something else, which in an emergency situation may be a very pressing duty, in which I think the circumstances of this accident show that the flight crew was very, very busy at the very beginning of the sequence and all the way through. Now, as far as the specific suggestions of what to put on first and what to put on second, flight crews are taught to maintain control of the aircraft first. If one person is putting on goggles or reaching back behind them to take them out of bags and things like that, the other person's got to stay on the flight controls without the protection of masks and goggles. And of course, in a rapidly worsening situation, that person may be incapacitated while they try and fly the airplane. So it's a very difficult situation, one that requires a lot of pilot judgment in implementation, and therefore we see it's not a simple answer of cut and dried, execute the first step of the procedure, which is put on the masks and goggles.
Thanks.
Member Hammersmith?
Captain Berman, you made reference to this survey or review that you conducted or that other staff conducted concerning smoke goggle use and familiarity. Could you tell us how many people we contacted in that survey process?
I talked to probably 10 line pilots and 3 or 4 training pilots from 4 or 5 different airlines, ranging from major carriers to national-sized jet carriers, DC-9 operators, as well as operators of large equipment, and found some very interesting diversity in the answers that I was receiving about what they were giving. And probably one of the most interesting things that came out of the survey is that this accident has received a lot of attention in the air carrier training departments. Welcome attention. There's new simulator scenarios being given to pilots in how to deal with a fire, and there are workstations being set up at some airlines where pilots are given an opportunity to try on the masks and goggles in a setting where they have time to deal with the situation and get to know what they want to do. And so there are some improvements that are around, and staff is suggesting some recommendations to ensure that this type of an activity is spread throughout the industry.
Right. And some of this new training has actually been put into practice, has it not?
Yes, it has been, and it's even been
Successfully.
used. The safety board's investigating an incident that was experienced by a major air carrier not too long ago, in which the flight crew experienced an electrical smoke situation where smoke came pouring out of some part of the cockpit in front of them, and they immediately executed their procedures, and the safety board has interviewed the flight crews and trainers of that airline, and they attributed their success to the training they had just received, and that training was received after this accident.
Right. Concerning smoke in the cabin and cockpit, could someone please describe what the smoke and soot flow patterns were that emanated from the fire occurring in the forward cargo compartment?
The soot, well, the airflow in the DC-9 airplane is generally the way the soot smoke patterns were found in the wreckage is reconstructed. The forward cargo compartment, of course, in the area of the hole, the breach, was extensively heat damaged, very heavy surrounding the initial immediate hole, where it was clean actually. It was quite heavily built up. The upper cabin materials from the passenger cabin outside of the lavatory were extensively sooted. The panels leading into the cockpit on the galley side they had a very heavy buildup, and there was some heat damage to the plastic. The flow of air as designed in the airplane would have been through the cockpit, through the circuit breaker and switch panels, down into the electronics bay. Inside the backs of the circuit breaker panels, the switch panels, there was very, very little evidence of any kind of soot. We found light sooting and darkening in a couple places in the cockpit, but not very extensive. The top of the oxygen bottle that would have been located behind the first officer's seat was darkened, and a couple other minor places like that. The flow going back to the hole between the cargo compartment and the passenger cabin, the flow designed is to go from the passenger cabin forward and then down along the tunnel areas aft. And back by the hole, we did find the flow pretty extensive, and then aft, especially on the left side toward the outflow valve.
Right. We stayed on page 80. The fuselage area near the cabin outflow butterfly and nozzle valves had a heavy soot trail extending aft on the left fuselage exterior surface near FS 980. Soot was found on both valve assemblies. What is the significance of any of that finding?
Remember, I'm sure we have a photograph that's shown that shows the soot pattern on the just after the outflow valve area. You can see the heavy soot, and as Bob was saying, that's the major exit for air coming from the passenger compartment.
Okay.
And there's also some indication from the soot pattern on that butterfly valve according to systems analysis, that the flight crew probably executed portions of a smoke clearing procedure on their way down.
That's what I was waiting to hear. Thank you. In this general area, another question. Could someone describe the Douglas Aircraft Company's manufacturer's cabin smoke or fume evacuation procedures? In other words, what the manufacturer of the DC-9 recommends as the way to eliminate the smoke from the cabin of the aircraft in flight?
The flight crew portion of the procedure is written now. We just put up a photo relevant to your last question, Member Hammerschmidt. Ben had mentioned the pattern of soot on the frame of the circular outflow valve. That you can see the pattern of soot there. You can see the dark pattern of soot above the top corner of the notebook, which we were able to measure toward an outflow valve position. Here and here. And the thickness of this soot going perpendicular across here happens to be the same thickness of the outflow valve, which is laying under the notebook. Having to do with your second question, having to do with the Douglas procedures, which we also found similar to a Boeing 747 procedure. Douglas found during flight tests in 1976 that by opening the forward right service door and the aft cabin door, they were able to induce
Now, when you say aft cabin, that's the tail cone.
the tail cone door. That's correct. Okay. They were able to induce a flow of air from the aft of the cabin coming forward, and it would be swept out through the right service door. The procedure cannot be done until the airplane is depressurized, which takes some coordination with the cockpit. They also tried, and I interviewed the engineer involved, they also tried to intentionally see if they could push the door far enough for a person to pass through. People are quite concerned, appropriately, about opening a cabin door in flight. They found that the airflow across the cabin door was so strong, even at low air speeds, that they could only get the door open about 1.5 inches normally. And when this rather large gentleman was pushing, he said that he could get it maybe up to 4 inches, but there was no way a person could pass through it.
And again, one point to emphasize there, that was the right service door. The aft door is in the cabin. It is not the cabin door that leads outside. It would be that bulkhead door going into the tail cone.
Right.
Now, from an operational perspective on that procedure was proposed by Douglas in the 1970s and had been considered by Douglas and the FAA through the 70s and even in the early 80s in response to one of our safety recommendations. However, the FAA wouldn't impose it as a required emergency procedure because they were concerned about its workability in practice. Douglas made it available to all air carriers operating the DC-9, and it has been adopted by some operators of that aircraft type. First of all, by the U.S. Air Force, which flies a similar aircraft. And, you know, Air Force procedures are different from air carrier procedures, so we looked further. It's been used by Northwest Airlines and its predecessor, Republic, and by Midwest Express Airlines, and a number of foreign air carriers, too. But in surveying, other air carriers are concerned about its workability, the coordination required from the cockpit to the cabin to get the doors opened and all. However, no one disputes that it's an effective procedure for a continuous smoke source in the cabin. It moves the smoke right out the front service door. Now, in terms of its applicability to this accident, we feel that due to the intense fire in the cabin, we are not certain what the effect would have been of applying this procedure in this case.
I'd like to finish on that thought. In not being sure of the applicability in this accident, that refers back to the progressive difficulties the crew is experiencing with the flight controls and floorboard degradation, pushing down on the flight control cables that we were able to find in the systems examination. But again, in addition to the ones Ben mentioned, U.S. Airways, Swiss Air, the military C-9s, and even the Boeing 747 passenger cabin doors have these in their manuals.
Okay. Thank you. One last question, following up on the chairman's line of questioning on the interphone system. Now, to be able to utilize this aircraft legally, it had to have an operative PA system. Now, had there been problems with the PA system prior to this flight?
Yes, the PA system had been experiencing problems on the inbound flight from Atlanta to Miami. In fact, it wasn't working during the flight, and the flight attendants had to use megaphones to communicate with the passengers. The captain radioed in to the maintenance facility in Miami and asked for a mechanic to meet the flight. However, they found that the PA system started working again as they taxied into the gate. The mechanic, according to reports, investigated the problem, found that the PA system amplifier was loose in the equipment rack and tightened it. So the PA system was working and was confirmed to have been working by witnesses we interviewed as the flight prepared to depart. People heard flight attendants using it as they were standing in the jetway. You're absolutely correct. If the PA system had continued to be inoperative, the airplane would have been grounded with an inoperative interphone because one of the two had to be functioning.
And that was also confirmed on the CVR. You can hear the PA announcement being made by the flight attendant.
Right, thank you. But can you imagine a worse situation in flight in which to have an inoperative cabin cockpit interphone system?
We have it here. I think the chairman's review of the overall philosophy of a minimum equipment list is the one we should focus on here. He said it has to be consistent with all procedures, including emergency procedures. Now, taking a little wider view of what the emergency procedures call for communications between cabin and cockpit, ValuJet, as well as every other airline, tells flight attendants to make the flight crew aware of emergency situations developing in the cabin. And as well, when an emergency is in progress, the flight crew needs to inform the flight attendants how much time is available, the nature of their considerations, and they need to coordinate possible emergency evacuations and other factors. So it's obvious that two-way communication is essential in an emergency, and the PA system is one-way communication. The captain and first officers could call back to the cabin, but it didn't go the other way.
Thank you, Mr. Berman.
Let me just, so we follow up on Member Hammersmith's comment before we go to Member Goliat, on the DC-9 procedure for smoke removal recommended by McDonnell Douglas, was that adopted by ValuJet?
No.
No, it was not.
And so neither the crew was obviously not trained on that procedure.
That's correct.
But you have here the manufacturer with the procedure on smoke removal, which the FAA in its wisdom determined did not need to be applied to all of the operators, and it's up to the operators to make a decision, and ValuJet chose not to do so, right?
That's correct.
Member Goliat?
I have one question. I don't know if, Ben, if you're the right person for the first question. I have two questions. In the report, it mentions that we have a air conditioning pack shut down. Can you articulate what effect that would have had on smoke entering the cockpit and being removed from the cockpit?
Bob Swain will handle that.
The airplane has two air conditioning packs which take the hot bleed air from the engine, compressor air from the engine, cool it, and then put it into what's essentially a plenum chamber, and then move that out into the cabin and the cockpit. The right pack is, the left pack comes into the plenum and has a inlet and an outlet that is biased toward the cockpit. So the left pack would be more effective in providing ventilation to the cockpit, although either pack can provide the total airplane's requirements. As we found the wreckage in the Everglades and then examined it at Tamiami, we found that one set of pack components had evidence of rotation, open valve positions and such, and one did not. One was in the closed position. For the right hand, stepping back, the DC-9 has a auto pack trip function that if you lose an engine on takeoff, the pack will shut down, and that way you won't lose bleed air power from the available engine. We have a possible auto trip situation in this airplane. We also have the knowledge from the flight data recorder that the right engine was pulled back to flight idle fairly quickly when they decided to come back. So from those indications, we tend to believe that it would have been the left pack that would have been operating at the time of impact. And the left pack, like I said, is biased to provide more flow to the cockpit. And this could possibly have contributed to the cockpit not having the extensive smoke we had in the cabin.
Now, we don't really know what they did or didn't do. Now, their procedures would have called for them to have turned off an air conditioning pack if they were experiencing smoke that they felt was coming from the air conditioning system. And their procedures specified they turn off the left pack first and try that. But
and what about if they're experiencing electrical difficulty?
Excuse me, I didn't hear you.
You know, early on the voice recorder, they mentioned they have an electrical problem, and followed shortly by indications of smoke. If they believe they had an electrical fire, would it call for shedding some of the load on the buses?
It might have called for that way down the line, but the initial actions would have, I think, occupied them all the way to the ground. They didn't verbalize any of the steps in the electrical smoke and fire procedure, and they may have taken the step of starting to depressurize the cabin manually, which was part of that procedure and another one. So it's possible that they would have turned a pack off either trying to deal with smoke that they thought was coming from air conditioning or later from shedding a load. But that load shedding procedure is very involved and would have required a lot of crew coordination and talk we didn't hear.
Now, some of these emergency procedures are memory items. Do we have any indication at all that the crew may have been running some of these procedures as memory items?
Well, we know, first of all, the first step in all those procedures was to put your oxygen mask and smoke goggles on. And we know that they didn't do that at the beginning of this sequence and anywhere down near to the end of it. And the only other indication we have of a memory item was this indication of a manual depressurization of the airplane. That's a memory item of the electrical fire and smoke procedure.
And how far down on the checklist is that item?
I'll have to consult it here.
The airlines are tending to get away from memory items and go right to checklists. That seems to be a new philosophy.
It's to switch it to manual is the third item in the list.
And the first two are?
Oxygen mask and smoke goggles, and then radio rack switch to Venturi. And we've got no information about that switch.
Okay. Ben, this one is also for you, I guess. When we went through the voice recorder and the sequence of events, there is a bit of a lag from when we have initial indications of problems until the airplane starts to turn around, and then we start coming down at a rate that would indicate passenger comfort, a rate that would indicate that we're still operating in the envelope that the crew was trained to fly in. My question goes to, do we have any belief that this and other crews could possibly benefit from aggressive, unusual attitude training that would get this airplane down? Now, you mentioned another accident we had where the crew took pretty quick action to get down, and we have speed limitations that are drilled into the flight crew's head that is not to exceed 250 knots below 10,000 feet. Could we benefit from having a recommendation that says or addresses some of these concerns about getting down on the deck as quickly as possible?
Well, I think in asking your question, you've showed a lot of the complexity of the issue, and that's one of the reasons that we're somewhat hesitant to venture into this area. But just reviewing the evidence of this accident, it's clear that the crew did continue away from Miami for some period of time. And now the analytical issue arises immediately. What were they doing during that time? And we've seen that they were quite busy at those times, just by watching the animation and seeing the succession of control difficulties and other systems and structures difficulties that they were dealing with. We feel that they were fairly well occupied. And it's also clear that they were attempting to follow air traffic control's vectors at that time. They weren't making a immediate dive and turn towards the airport.
And it's clear, John, early on that this crew was distracted, would have to have been distracted by the door by that door being opened, and the sounds that were coming from the cabin itself.
Emergency overload is what I've taken to call the sequence of events in the cockpit. The human brain can only comprehend so much going on at any one moment, and it's pretty clear from what I've been reading, what you all have provided to us, that this crew had more to do than they could comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
But I noticed one thing was also missing. I guess I'm going to add this question now. With a two-man crew, no longer do we have the ability to send somebody back to assess the situation. So the crew now becomes very dependent upon the flight attendant, most likely the lead flight attendant, to give them accurate information about the condition of the emergency and what is going on. And I noticed in listening to the cockpit voice recorder, this crew did not have the benefit of that in any way, shape, or manner, other than somebody yelling fire, 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 which is certainly not enough information for one to put into the equation to what kind of action is appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
Does staff have any thoughts about the role of the lead flight attendant in that situation?
Well, I think in the case of this accident, the communication that was going on was actually about as good as we've seen in the in-flight emergencies. The flight attendant was unfortunately trapped up near the cockpit. There was a raging fire going on right behind her, and she opened the door and communicated with them, for better or for worse, as we discussed with the issue of smoke entering the cockpit.
Because she had no other way to communicate.
Yes, exactly. Now, if you look back to some of the other cases we've investigated, take, for example, the DC-9 that crashed at Cincinnati of Air Canada in-flight fire, and the Saudia L-1011 accident that we've already mentioned. Those presented very, very serious issues of communication. In one case, the miscommunication caused the flight crew to overestimate, and then re-underestimate the severity of the problem in the Cincinnati case, and then fly over about half of the state of Ohio before they got serious about descending to land. In the Saudia case, there was also a delay because they weren't sure where and how serious the fire was. In the American Airlines hazardous materials spill that we've discussed, the flight crew remained unaware of the severity of the situation throughout the approach and landing. And so I think it's a very, very serious problem. In this case, because of just the location of the fire, the situation of the flight attendant, and probably also the flight crew's ability to just look over their shoulder when the door was open, we think they were probably pretty aware that they had a very serious situation going on.
Thank you. No further questions.
Member Black.
Try to make this short. Mr. Fife and I had the opportunity of a couple of days ago to spend a lot of time in jump seats coming back from Guam, and I think on 2 or 3 different airplanes we pulled the smoke masks out to look at them in the cockpit, and I think all of the ones that I recall were wrapped in a very thick plastic material, which you make reference to in the report. I've had numerous flight crews raise the issue of, one, getting the things out in the amount of time allowable because of this plastic container, and it seems to be industry-wide. And the other issue that has been raised to me is pilots who wear eyeglasses, once they get the smoke goggles out, put them on the oxygen mask, the smoke goggles, then adjusting their eyeglasses, especially for an instrument approach, is a fairly major issue. I think we have addressed this. I hope we continue to, because this is a concern in the industry, and a lot of it is brought out by this particular flight. One more observation that I'd have to make is that this business of knocks on the doors, I think, might be being confused Nora, with the let me in, I'm not a terrorist type knock code that they develop sometime, I find it difficult to believe that an emergency communication could occur unless they knew Morse code by knocks on the doors. You could say, yes, we've got an emergency, but in order to describe it like we've been talking about, I certainly agree with the chairman and others. This interphone business sounds like it's a critical issue, and I can't think of any replacement for it between the two. You might, Captain Berman, comment on that.
Well, we concur with your points. We don't see an easy replacement for that. And the smoke goggles wrapped in plastic issue is something that was discovered as a result of this accident. And several of the airlines that I've spoken to have taken action and torn open the plastic bags so that the flight crews can take the goggles out more easily.
I
But
can tell
as
you
you
two
found
that
out,
haven't yet. But
as you found out, some haven't. And so we've proposed recommendations to ask the FAA to make sure they all open the plastic bags up.
Well, are there any other questions on this issue item, the second safety issue item we've discussed? I might note that the staff has, when we get to the safety recommendations, 7 safety recommendations that are being made out of this particular area that will address the concerns that have been discussed here by the board. And one of which will be to address the service interphone issue. It is 10 minutes to 12. We have a number of individuals who have, for the purpose of this board meeting, flown in here to attend, who have flights this evening. It is the chairman's intent to try to continue this meeting without an extended lunch break. We will, however, at this time, take a break